All right, now we have Carmen Miller with Hatchways.io. They are a company that helps new developers find jobs at startups, and she's going to be telling us talking about acing the technical interview. Go ahead, Carmen.
All right, I will share my screen. 1 minute. Oops, not that. All right, my slides look okay? Okay, so my name is Carmen, and I'm going to be talking about how to prepare and be ready to ace the technical interview before any kind of interviews you have. I work at Team Hatchways, which I'll talk a little bit more about on my intro page. And this is a good presentation for asking questions as you go. So feel free to just jump in on audio and share any questions, and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well. So just a brief overview. I'm going to give an introduction to who I am and where I work and why this is something that I'm comfortable talking about. And then we're going to talk about things you can do before the interview, things you should do during the interview, and then kind of do a detailed walkthrough of what to do in different parts of the interview, and then just some kind of parting thoughts and final tips for success. So specifically, when I mean technical interview, I mean the whiteboarding style, leak code style, data structures and algorithm interview. We won't be touching on things like walking through a project or doing pair programming or system design, things like that. Some of it will be applicable, but that won't be the focus of this. So a general introduction, I am a full stack developer at Hatchways, and Hatchways is essentially a recruiting platform. We help identify talent by doing take-home assessments rather than doing resume screening or anything like that. And we give feedback to everyone who comes through our platform, and those that we deem as ready to get jobs, we hook up with our employers, and when there's a match in profiles of tech stack and location and things like that, we set up interviews. So we help developers get their next job is our main mission statement. So in addition to development, it is a little bit similar to TripleByte. Good question, but rather than a, rather than a like multiple choice quiz, it's an actual take home assessment. So there's instructions and you have to write an app, whether there's a front end one, a back end one, and a general one. And then we evaluate your code, and then you proceed to an interview, and there's a couple different options for that. So it's, I think it's a lot more user-friendly than TripleByte, and we also give more actionable personal feedback to everyone as well. And then as a developer at Hatchways, I am involved in both interviewing candidates and also helping them prepare for the interviews we set up with our partner employers. So I see a lot of common problems when people go through the interview process, and I do a lot of coaching on how to better do it. So this is something I kind of know a lot about at this point. I agree. I also thought TripleByte was not a good evaluation of my skills. We try to make our evaluation as close to what it's like, what you actually would do at a job, because this type of interview is not like what you actually do at a job, which we'll talk about. So diving in, before you get to the interview, there's a lot you need to do to prepare to do well in the interview. So there's a lot of background knowledge. At the very first, you need to be comfortable coding on the spot. You want to be able to write out a function and use your like array methods and your map and your set and your object, all of these things without looking up syntax, without relying on your go-to code editor for completion or anything like that. And it can be surprising when you're just used to writing, say, like React apps and your IDE of choice, and you don't work in a different environment writing something completely new from scratch. It can be harder than you realize to have all of that comfortable under your fingers. So make sure you're comfortable with that. You do need to know your data structures and algorithms. If you get a question like reverse a linked list or reproduce a stack or a queue, you aren't going to be able to do that if you don't know what those are. you need to know big O notation. You should be able to analyze a code solution that you write in terms of time complexity and space complexity. And you should be able to do so accurately. So an important part of this is not just knowing what makes an n-squared time complexity algorithm, but also specifically what that looks like in your code. So a lot of people know to look for nested for loops, but they might not know that, say, array.includes inside of a for loop is a nested for loop, because includes just loops through the entire array, whereas something like a set or an object allows constant lookup time. So knowing kind of the nitty-gritty complexity of every operation you might want to use is good to know. There's also some common patterns, and we will talk about that on the next slide in more detail. And you should know going in what to expect. What should you do? What will they do? Things like that. And we'll talk more about that. And then a good resource, someone was kind enough to post a link in the chat. This is just one I took, and I really like it because it's in JavaScript. And this is by Colt Steele, if anyone is familiar with him. He talks about how to approach problems, common patterns, and then works through all of the different data structures and algorithms you might need to know. So it's just kind of a really good one-stop place to go. He does have a cool name. He's entertaining as well. It's a one-stop place to go for basically most of the prep work that you would need to do for this kind of interview. Okay, so moving on to common patterns. I'm not going to get into the technical definition of all of these, but there are common patterns, things like frequency counter, where you're counting things as you work through a string array, or multiple pointers, where you have a couple different variables and they're moving at different points as you work through an input. Sliding window, divide and conquer. Some people are sharing some good links as well, it looks like. When you first look at these kind of patterns, they're the kind of thing where it might not occur to you to approach a problem this way, but after you learn that this is a thing, you'll realize that it's very useful to solve a lot of problems that come up in this space. So when you have a problem and you aren't quite sure how to approach it, one of these patterns could be kind of the secret key that you need to figure out to get an efficient solution for the problem being asked. Okay, in terms of knowing what to expect, it's really important to communicate as much as possible in one of these interviews. You basically want to think out loud constantly. So the interviewer starts by asking you a question. You should respond by talking out loud as you digest the question, explaining your thought process, talk about what you're doing as you're coding. We'll kind of get into more of like the actual process in a minute, but the interviewer wants to know what your thought process is and not just what your code looks like. So it's important to do a lot of talking. It is okay to ask questions, but make them as infrequent and informed as possible. So when I'm interviewing, there's a big difference when someone says, "I'm stuck, can you help me out here? I'm not sure what to do," versus someone who says, "So I see that I need to at least do this with my input, and it's probably going to require, at least 2 loops through all of the data to get everything. And I know I'm going to have to gather this data as I go, but I'm not sure the best way to go about that. Do you have a suggestion?" So basically sharing how you got to that question and some context will make it a much better question in terms of how that reflects your thinking. You also want to keep code cleanliness in mind. When you are writing in an interview, I'm assuming that that is similar to how you will write when you are contributing to my code base. So for example, single letter variable names are much less ideal than variable names that are actually meaningful. So I want you to use the same kind of variable names and function names that you would when you are working on a project when you're in the coding interview. And then a couple of really good resources for this kind of knowing what to expect. Interviewing.io has recordings of actual interviews from some of the big tech companies, and you can kind of see the whole process from how is the question asked, how does someone figure it out, what's the communication back and forth between the interviewer and the interviewee. I thought it was really reassuring when I watched one and the person really struggled to get it figured out at first. Yeah, so that's a good example of kind of like what real life interviews are like. Yeah, so there's quite a few of them on this site. And something important to note is that depending on the job you're applying to, there's going to be different levels of difficulty. So if, for example, you are applying to a coding position at a company that is not a tech company, and you're a junior developer, you're going to have one level of question. If you're applying to be a senior developer at Google, that's going to be a very different level of question. So don't assume that when you watch a recording like that, that is the kind of question they're going to ask you. It's more about the process that's kind of the same across whatever level you're looking at. And then another good resource is interviewcake.com. Just has a whole series of articles about, like, first you'll get a phone screen. What are they going to ask? And then you have the whiteboarding. What should I do to prepare for that? And then what's it mean when you ask to meet the CEO, things like that. And it's good background knowledge. And then they talk about everything like get a good night's sleep the night before, things like that. Okay, here's an important one. How do you practice in a way that is going to help you actually improve? So a big thing for me is focusing on the problem solving and not just memorizing, say, like the first 20 LeetCode questions. First, memorizing won't necessarily help you solve a problem you've never seen before. And second, a lot of times companies will ask something very similar to a well-known problem, but with a twist. And if you have things memorized and you assume that what they're asking is what you have memorized, but you're missing that twist, that's not going to reflect well on your ability to actually follow what's being asked and solve it. I recommend spending about 30 minutes on a single problem before you stop and look at the solution. If you spend much less than that, then you're not really giving it a good try. And if you are in an interview and you were stuck, they're not going to stop the interview early just because you didn't figure it out quickly. You're going to have to keep working on it for that full 20 to 40 minutes that is budgeted for the tech interview. But on the flip side, if you spend 2 hours trying to figure out a problem on your own, that's not necessarily an efficient use of time, and it won't necessarily help you, say, 4 times more than if you only spend 30 minutes. So I say give it a half hour, see what you can do, and then look up a solution. Even if it's not on whichever site you happen to be using, YouTube and various things like that have solutions to a lot of different problems. Definitely practice only in one language. I see a good number of people who say work and have both JavaScript and Python, and they're mixing up the syntax for those 2 languages when they're writing code. And it's hard for me, the interviewer, to know if they just happen to be using both at work and they're mixing it up, or if they just actually don't know the syntax for their language of choice. You should also practice talking out loud because it's not natural to talk while coding. And especially when you are debugging in particular is really hard for people to talk out loud. So practicing that part of it as well. Practicing without your regular code editor. So you are used to things like not having your syntax highlighting, not having auto formatting. We work with one company who asks people to write their interviews in a Google Doc because they really want like literally no help in writing the code, and they just want to see what you can do on your own. And then finally, practicing a little bit frequently is going to be better than just trying to get in 7 hours of work the day before. Couple of good resources. Codingcoach.io has mock openings where you can apply to a pretend job and have a pretend interview. from one of the mentors on their site. And that's a great way to get personalized feedback from often someone who does interviewing as part of their job, and kind of see what it's like in a more realistic way than like a pramp, where it's probably just another person who is looking for a job who's going to be practicing with you. That being said, pramp is useful because it can be good to have that kind of live interaction and practice being nervous, basically. And then, of course, LeetCode and HackerRank. Looks like there's a question. With the rise of microservices, wouldn't it be better to know multiple languages? So I would say it's good to know multiple languages as you're working on like learning and writing projects and like just generally developing your skills. Knowing more than one language is good, and knowing when to use different languages is good. But specifically for answering this kind of coding question, I would recommend only using one because it can be so easy to mix up syntax. And I would say there are some languages that are easier to solve these kind of things than other languages. And generally, like, most people are only job searching for hopefully a short amount of time. So I wouldn't necessarily say only use one language ever. It's just while you are specifically focusing on getting ready for job interviews, I would focus primarily on one language. Okay, any other questions about kind of stuff to do beforehand before we dive into the interview itself? All right, so first I'm gonna start big picture and then I'm gonna get more into details. Looks like we have one more question. If I'm interviewing for multiple jobs and the companies use different languages, I know they sometimes insist you use theirs, but is that common and something to prepare for, or should I stick to one anyway? So it's hard to know because it is different from company to company, but most companies will let you code in any language you want for the interview, especially if you have, you know, a solid resume that shows that you do indeed know the skills that they want, then it shouldn't be a problem to do the interview in another language. That being said, there are some companies who want to know that their language is the one you can code on the spot in. So I would look at the job posting and see if there's, see how much they rank the importance of a particular language. If it's like on a list of like nice to have, or if they have a list of like 2 or more languages, then it's probably fine to use any language in the interview. But that's one of those things that's, you know, it is kind of different from company to company how much value they put on it. At our company, someone can use any language, and as long as they have something on their resume showing that they know our tech stack, we'll just trust their resume and look at the coding interview for just the general like problem solving type skills rather than the specific language skills. And is it advisable to have an interview language? So I agree that Python is really nice for algorithms. I don't think it's a problem to have an interview language if you're comfortable with Python, as long as you know that you can write Python comfortably in the interview without like your JavaScript syntax sneaking in. Like in both daily, I do tend to mix them up. But if you have like kind of focused practice where you're doing a lot more Python leading up to this kind of thing, it probably is fine to switch from your primary language to kind of your coding language for interviews. Oh man, right? And a common one is length a property or a method? I don't know what is about length, but people mix that up all the time in my interviews. Exactly, yeah. Okay, so diving into the interview itself, I'm going to start with, there's a couple different big picture approaches. So when you're going into an interview, it's good to have a framework, like a plan for what you're going to do, more granular than answer the question. So I've got a couple different suggestions, And of course, everyone is going to have something that works a little bit different for them. And these are similar at the big level, but it's kind of nice to have like a checklist, essentially, of what you should do. So I've got 2 different big picture checklists, and then we'll dive through like in more detail as you go through the interview. So the first suggested approach is start with discussion. So this is like, do you understand the question? What is your game plan? Why you're making the choices you are? Then solving. And then if you haven't yet figured out the best solution, you can start with either an inefficient solution or a simpler solution, so you can just get something written. Then go back and optimize, whether that's cleaning up because it was a little bit messy, or making it more efficient, or fixing it to address all of the edge cases that you hadn't quite figured out yet, and then testing it. I do want to note that while communication is important, there is a balance to be had between talking too much and talking too little. And you should kind of base how much discussion you do before you start coding on how complex the question is. Sometimes we ask a simple question and someone explains their thought process. They write pseudocode for their thought process. They walk me through their pseudocode. They provide one more big picture overview of what they're doing and why. And then by then half of our time is gone. And when they start writing, they get mixed up a little bit on the logic and have a hard time finishing in time because they spent too much time talking. So if it's a simple question, you don't necessarily need a complex discussion answer. You just need enough to let me know, as the interviewer, what you're planning to do before you start. I know, right? I generally like the idea of writing pseudocode as an outline, but it actually, more often than not, seems to take so much time that it's not actually a useful thing overall. Okay, so this is kind of approach 1. Approach 2, just a different way of breaking it down into a checklist, is 1, understand the problem. Make sure you understand why the given inputs produce the given outputs. And then work through concrete examples. It's good to work through both the provided examples and additional examples. Most of the time, if you are given an example, it won't cover all of the edge cases that you are expected to address. So coming up with some additional edge cases of unusual input or things like that, and then walking through what the output would be for those. And then break it down into parts. So not just, I'm going to write a function to create this output, but like, first I'm going to process the data, then I'm going to have a for loop, and then inside the loop, I'm going to do this specific thing to put this part of it into my data structure, and then I'm going to output this. So like really outline every bit of the logic before you dive into the code. And then do the actual code to solve, or solve a simpler version of it if you don't know the best solution for the original question. And then you can look back and refactor, whether that's addressing those extra edge cases, etc. So now we'll dive into like step by step what that looks like. So first, they're going to ask the question. They're probably going to paste it into the shared code editor and read it out loud and walk through some examples. It's important to not just dive in, as I've mentioned. If it looks familiar, it might be, but it might not be. So you want to be careful. Don't assume that the provided examples are representative. So for example, if you're provided this input and output, some of the questions you can ask is, will the array always be sorted? Does the output need to be sorted? Can we rely on it being only integers, or can they be negative numbers, letters, anything else like that? It's a good idea to think of basically what are all of the odd types of data that I could be putting into this? What if I put in empty data, like an empty array? What if I put in sorted or unsorted? Really large or really small? Negative numbers. Every kind of odd input that you can think of would be good to test on the question to see what kind of output. And a lot of times you might be told, oh, you don't need to worry about that, but not all the time. And then in those cases, it's important information to recognize from the beginning so you can address that in your solution. And then writing a template. So you always want to write an actual function and return an actual result, not just write the code straight into the code editor without any kind of structure. So take variables for your input, etc. As I mentioned before, like I like the idea of writing like pseudocode or comments inside your function, but you have to be careful that you do so quickly enough that it doesn't eat up all of your time. And then as I mentioned before, you do want descriptive names for all of your functions and variables. And then be sure to return the result rather than printing it. Okay, so more about discussing the solution. I talk about communication a lot because it's really important. There's a big difference between the kind of interviewer who tells me what they're going to do, tells me what they're doing while they're doing it, and then tells me afterwards like why it was good that they did it that way, versus someone who just immediately starts coding and doesn't say a word the whole time. There's so much more information that you can provide to me about what you will be like as a member of my team that I'm going to be working with when you are able to talk more and share more information. So some specific things to start thinking about. When you're looking at the problem, you don't want to solve the first solution that comes to your head. Most of the time, these questions have a brute force solution, and then they have an efficient solution. And you want to get to that efficient solution rather than just starting on that first one you think of. So it's good to say, I just recognize the problem is this. We could initially solve it like that, which we would do so in this way. And then if you know big O, and you should bring that up proactively and say, well, the brute force solution would be this complexity, and I think there's probably a more efficient way. And then if you know the efficient way, you would share it then. And also note that by discussing your thought process, even if you don't know, if you haven't yet figured out that efficient way, by talking through it, you give your interviewer a chance to help you. A lot of times, they try to be helpful and they want to see you succeed. So they might ask probing questions or straight up give you solutions or give you hints that will help get you in the right direction. So the more chances you give them to help you, the better off you'll be. And then finally, if you have talked it through, they aren't really helping, but you still don't know what you're doing in terms of the best solution, go ahead and just let them know that you think there's a better way, but you can't come up with it yet, and you'd like to go ahead and start coding. Now, when you've gotten to this point, you can finally start coding. And it's kind of funny, I say this wrapping up at the point that you start coding. You should actually start coding before the middle point of your time. If you get stuck at any point, please at least check in with the interviewer. There's nothing like looking at a shared code editor and then it goes silent and there's no more typing, and 90 seconds in, I'm wondering if your internet connection went off or you're Googling or what's going on. So it can be hard to think out loud while you're debugging, but at least occasionally saying, okay, I think the problem is here. I'm thinking about how to solve it. Okay, I've identified that it's probably this variable, but I still haven't figured out why. You know, like just basic things like that to just keep them aware of both what you're working on and also how your logic works to help you get from initial problem to a solution. And then as you're working through it, if you started with a suboptimal plan and you figure out as you're working what the solution should be, let your interviewer know, and then either finish your first pass and then go back, or change what you have and fix it as you go. And that decision of which way to do it is kind of how much of a mess you'll make while doing it. If you just started, it should be easy to fix it up as you go. But if you're most of the way done, you'll probably want to finish and make sure you have something running before you go back and try to rewrite it, because you definitely want to have something running and solving some edge cases before the end of the time, even if it's not the best solution. Okay, so you've written your code. Take a look at it afterwards and make sure you aren't missing any basic things, whether it's like typos or logic missteps, anything like that, and then actually run your code. Be proactive, and as soon as you are finished writing it and walking through it, run the test cases without having to be asked to do so, and do both the provided example test cases as well as some additional ones. Once you do that, hopefully it works and it solves every edge case, in which case the interviewer might either give additional test cases that break it, or they might ask you about it, ask you about time complexity if you haven't talked about it, or they can just move on to another question. Okay, so very important topic is what to do if you get stuck. First thing is to remember that these problems are meant for you to get stuck. If these problems were easy, then they wouldn't be useful in differentiating between different developers' level of skill at this type of interview. So things you can do is solve a simpler version of it or an inefficient version of it. Whether that's only solving half of the test cases or solving in n squared time. If you can get something working, that's better than not getting anything. You can walk through an example input by hand. So just literally, how do you get from input to output? What steps do you take? And then you can step back and say, okay, how do I replicate that in my code? And then there's some questions that you can ask to help you solve it. So how would a human solve this? So not even thinking about how to put it in code, but just how did I know, looking at the input, that that would be the output? And then you can say, okay, how can I replicate that? Is there a data structure that would make this easier? 9 times out of 10, the answer is a hash map. And a hash map, it will make this problem better. Not always though. Would one of the problem solving patterns, say sliding windows, help? And then am I using all of the information that was provided? In these questions, it's very rare that there's anything that's included that is not necessary for you to get the full correct answer. So if there is a phrase or a test case that is not something you have thought about and are using, then that might be the key piece of missing information. Okay, and then some final notes, and then time for any more questions. So general, that is a cat. I can grab her afterwards and show her, but my headphones aren't that long. So don't assume that a familiar looking question is one you've done before. I say this because it happens more than you think it does. Walking through edge cases and not just to provide an input, watching for signs that you might be missing something. So if you have a solution for half of the test cases, and then for each edge case after that, you are adding special checks for that one edge case, and now you have like 3 extra if statements that weren't there before and won't solve all of the problems without each of those, you're probably doing something wrong, and there's a way you can redesign it to more cleanly solve the problem. If you are writing out every letter of the alphabet into an object, you're probably doing something wrong. Any kind of hard coding or excessive amount of work for edge cases is probably doing something wrong. You want to explain the entire plan before starting. It's not enough, for example, to map and that'll solve everything and then start coding. That doesn't tell me, the interviewer, what your plan is, and it also doesn't help you make sure you actually have the logic figured out, because a lot of times the talking is as much for you as it is for the interviewer, because you need to know what you're doing before you get to the code. Thinking out loud while you're debugging, as well as how to approach the problem. Bringing up efficiency without being asked, that's always like kind of the set apart the top candidates from the average candidates, is saying, okay, here's my plan. This is the efficiency. By using this data structure, I'm able to leverage this advantage of it. And then speed is secondary to quality. Never try to rush through it because you want to get it all done when that might cost you efficiency or code cleanliness or get you caught in trying to figure out the logic. And then finally, most people hate this type of interview, and for a good reason. They are very hard, but it is also learnable. It's useful to try to think about why companies do this kind of coding interview. There's a lot of discussion about how they're not representative of the job, they're not a fair way to evaluate people. But the reason most companies continue to do them is because they don't have a better alternative. So thinking about why a company does this, they want to know that you know how to code. They want to know that you know how to solve problems. And they want to know that you can think logically and communicate. So if you can showcase those skills, that's more important than getting the perfect, efficient solution written quickly. So I find that focusing on the most important thing is not actually solving the problem. And keeping that in mind can make it less stressful as you go through the problem. Okay, Nick, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I guess I would ask, how would you describe the kind of average level of input and sort of collaboration you would have with an interviewer? You're not going to pair program it out. So what's the sort of level of input you should normally expect?
I would expect very little. Even when it is different from place to place, but even at the places where you have a friendly, helpful interviewer, it's still going to be very minimal. Most of the time, they won't talk to you if you don't talk to them first with a question. And most of the time, they will do very minimal helping along the way outside of a couple of kind of pointed questions that they might ask. And part of that is to make sure that there is a equal chance between all of the applicants, because I don't want to help, say, one person more than I help everyone else, because that's not quite a fair comparison. And most of the time when they are interacting with you, it will be in that initial discussion of how you approach it, and not as you're working through it. Although sometimes I will, if you're really stuck on syntax, I will write the syntax for you to keep going. But in general, I would say pretty minimal.
Ooh, Carmen, I have a question. Wait, Can I ask a question now? Is that all right? Oh, yeah, because you wanted to be interactive.
I'm done. Yeah.
Cool. I have a question. In your experience in Hatchway, have you ever seen really, I don't know, cool or unique things that people have done in their interviews that you were like, damn, that was risky and it worked out? Does that kind of make sense? Or I understand the structure of the interview process, especially for devs. And I'm wondering, how can I inject my own flair into this? So I'm just kind of curious how people, other creatives, have kind of reshaped it, shaken things up a bit.
So I don't know that I would say I've seen anyone do something risky. I definitely like when you are proactive. So what that can look like in the coding interview specifically is things like explaining why you are doing things. Someone mentioned the other day that they're using a for of instead of a for each because they want to be able to break out early. Showing off little bits of extra knowledge like that. If you use a map instead of an object, that's going to look good. I've had some people who are competitive coders, and they have really beautifully written code with perfect comments and written in half the time most people write it, and fancy test cases where you're not just console logging your for examples after running it. Competitive coding is a thing, yeah. There's some good ways that you can also kind of show flair in the behavioral side of things too. like being a really good storyteller, proactively offering to demo a project when appropriate can be a cool way to show new skills that you have. Yeah, I don't know if that's the kind of answer you were looking for.
Totally was. I mean, I love ideas. So it's just kind of cool to see what people do and see how they're kind of, I don't know, do that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so this was my last slide. If anyone has any other questions, I would be happy to answer them.
So I was curious, you mentioned testing a lot, and that is very important even in actual production development, but would it be a bad idea to go ahead and write basically your testing function, a bunch of test cases during that discussion phase to basically show that you're taking a test-driven development type approach to show that you know that, I guess, is it behavior or pattern? I don't know the right word for that.
Yeah. I don't think most of these are necessarily the kind of question that are complicated enough that I would really label it as test-driven development at that point. But I do think it is a nice structure if you write out, and I mean, like test cases, I don't mean like anything complicated. Like you really do only just, like run the function on your different inputs and make sure the output is logged. But I do think it would be a nice structure if you like kind of wrote the shell of your function and then wrote your test cases that as you were planning to run it. And then it's like, as you're working through that, you could be like, okay, so these are the base cases. This is an edge case that we're going to make sure we solve by adding this. And then this is the edge case we'll solve by adding that kind of thing. I would say that makes sense.
Perfect. Thank you.
Competitive coding. I will note that just being really good at the actual coding is not enough for me to think that you are someone I want to hire. It does take the additional things like the communication skills. The best candidates, of course, are good at everything I'm looking for. But like, say, if you are really into competitive coding, still being able to do things like explaining why you're doing what you're doing is important as well.
Does it vary pretty widely what sort of tools you're allowed to use for coding for a whiteboard? Like, for example, using your own whiteboarding application, or it might just be like the Google Doc, like you said?
Yeah, so most companies have a particular thing that they use, and most will use like an actual code editor designed for doing interviews. I don't think most places are crazy enough to use a Google Doc. So like we use codeinterview.io. That's the kind of thing that if like you can probably ask ahead of time, especially if it's just like a recruiter that you're working with, and they'll send you the name of what they use. Like we have zero problem with you getting comfortable with the tools that we're going to use before the interview, because that's not really what we're testing for. So if you are concerned, I would definitely recommend asking, but trying out just like Google, if you were a company looking for a program to use for this, how would you look for it? And then you'll find lots of results of options that companies are using. I think I saw that someone was raising their hand. If whoever that was.
Sorry if I jumped ahead of you.
You want to go ahead and ask your question? Whoever has
a
question.
I don't know if it counts as a question or not. It's like halfway between question and thought. So I heard Alexander's question and thought of it as like, how do I stand out and be memorable outside of just being good at whiteboarding? Like, how can I show off personality traits? How can I do anything other than just describe code, write code while commenting on code, do a really good job?
Right. So I think the easiest way to shine is outside of the actual coding. So most of the time you'll either have multiple interviews, or the coding will be sandwiched in a bigger interview where they start with whether it's like a tell me about yourself kind of question, or they might do some like JavaScript knowledge. Like I had one question where the very first thing he said was, an object-oriented programming kind of question. And then at the end, they almost inevitably will say, do you have any questions for me? And I think that is one of the easiest ways to shine, because it's almost guaranteed that they're going to ask you, do you have any questions for me? And having well thought out questions, especially ones that are specific to that particular company, shows a high level of interest. And like if you did some legwork, that's going to reflect really well. And it's interesting because that's pretty common advice on the internet, to ask questions. And I would say maybe only like 5 out of 100 people actually have questions for me at the end of an interview. And even it's as basic questions as like, what's the day-to-day like in this job? Or what do you like about your job? Or what are some challenges that your team is trying to solve? Right? I always have a ton of questions too. I'm a big question asker. But the best kind of questions are questions that show you researched the company, questions that show you were really interested in this particular 5% was the percent I gave of how many people actually have questions. And then like in terms of like what psychology research says, yeah, right? 5% is so low. Psychology research says the more the interviewer does the talking, the more they're gonna like you. So asking questions about them personally, like a useful one can be, what is something that you want to change about your role? Because it gives you insight about what might not be great at that company, while also letting them talk about themselves is always good. And then there's a lot you can do if you have a full behavioral interview where you can highlight your strengths. Like a lot of people will go through an interview and they'll answer the questions, but they won't like market themselves. Like it's okay. The best answers showcase your strengths as a developer, so I know why I really want to hire you, versus just answering the question and moving on. And if anyone else has suggestions in the chat for things that you think are good for interviews in general, I'm sure we've got some other people here who are either involved in hiring or have been hired and know what might work.
Well, since we were on the conversation of competitive coding and coding challenges and such, I'm just going to plug my Code Cottage event again. It's a practice for talking about code, and you can also learn from others. You might see some of those methods or classes that you may not see often or know of. So it's a good chance to learn from others. And I make people talk about their code. So it's good practice for that, for describing your code.
Yeah.
I want to mention that again. It's a great event. And just because we're a JavaScript group, I do pick out problems that have options for other languages as well. So sometimes you get a chance to see people solve the same problem in different languages. And plus, I enjoy coding challenges, so it's fun for me.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm applying for a Django like developing job for Django.
Okay.
What's the percentage of questions that are going to be like problem solving, and the other percentage would be like my knowledge of Django?
So that also is really variable from company to company. That's a good question too. So I think more often than not, they're not going to be asking Django specific questions in the interview. They might, and I would be prepared for big picture ones, but most likely they're just going to have a more typical, normal interview process where it's like, you've got your phone screen that's behavioral, you've got your coding, you might have a final system design, and then you're just on the job, and they just assume that if you can do the other stuff, you can do the Django as well, especially if you have it on your resume. Yeah. Occasionally there are companies who will really get into the weeds of, do you know, the ins and outs of what's unusual about the particular framework or language they like. And then sometimes you'll have an hour-long coding interview and they've got 10 minutes of questions, and they might throw a couple in the beginning about that kind of thing. But I would say most interviews spend most time on kind of the more traditional expected coding style question. Yeah, there's a most companies, what you do in the interview is not going to be what you do at the job. Any other questions?
Do y'all at Hatchways just pretty much exclusively work with startups, or do you work across the industry?
So we work primarily with startups, and the main reason for that is that the bigger the company, the more solidified their hiring processes are. So they're less open to trying new things, like interviewing people that never really had a resume screening, which is what we do. We do work with a wide range of companies. Like, we work from small to medium size is really what it is. They're not all like startups, early stages. Some of them are well established and have grown quite a bit. And we work with companies all over both US and Canada. So just a general plug, anyone who is looking and is interested in working at a smaller company, I would highly recommend trying the Hatchways process. At the very worst, you'll get some nice feedback on some code you've written. At the best, you'll get an interview with us and then an interview with other companies as well.
And Hatchways also has the post bootcamp grad program. You want to go over that?
Yeah, so we call it a co-op program. It is a 4-week program where you work in a team and build a project, and you have daily stand-ups and are assigned tickets with a more experienced senior lead on your team, and then 4 people who are all a little bit newer. And you get experience of building a project that's a really nice thing to put on your resume and share. Then we have like a post program where we focus on helping you get jobs. So you have weekly sessions where you can do things like practicing pair programming. You get interview preps with people like me. You get help on your resume, things like that. Yeah. So this is for the co-op program specifically. If you're looking at just straight up applying, our homepage is the way to get started for that. And then whichever program you are interested in, the first step is completing an assessment. And as I mentioned, you can pick a front-end one, a back-end one, or a full-stack one. And that's basically a day-long kind of project, like 12 hours that you would want to spend on that, or less if you're faster. But yeah, if anyone has questions about Hatchways or generally just kind of wants to talk about preparing for interviews, my email is on the screen. I'm always happy to talk to people. Brandon can give us a good recommendation. He's doing very well in our program right now.
And I'm guessing y'all are a Seattle-based company?
We are Toronto-based, actually.
Oh.
Yeah.
The other side of the continent.
I am not in Toronto. I am actually down in Olympia.
Oh, cool.
So it's kind of nice to be talking to people in my time zone. Yeah. The company started in Toronto and started working only with Toronto companies, but is now, especially in current times when everything's remote anyway, we work all over the continent.
All right. Thank you, Carmen.